Hello, my name is Robert Szymczak. I'm an emergency physician. I'm working at the Department of Emergency Medicine at the Medical University of Gdańsk and Helicopter Emergency Medical Service, also in Gdańsk in Poland. And I'm going to talk about acute altitude illness. So the main problem at high altitude is decreasing atmosphere pressure with every step you take. With the rising altitude, the atmosphere pressure decreases, and then the pressure also of the oxygen decreases. So see here you can see the graph in which the barometric pressure at sea level is 760 millimeters of mercurium, but at the level of 5,000 meters is around one half of it, and at the Everest altitude of 8,000 meters, one third of the oxygen pressure, which is at sea level. When we would treat it in a way that at the sea level we've got 100% of available oxygen, then at the top of Rysy, the highest peak of Tatra Mountains in Poland, at 2,500 meters, we would have 20% less available oxygen. At the altitude of the highest peak in Europe, Elbrus, or highest peak in Africa, Kilimanjaro, we will have 50% of available oxygen in comparison to the sea level. And at the level of 8,000 meter peaks and the highest ones, the Everest, K2, we have around 30% of the available oxygen in comparison to sea level. So that's the difference of oxygen availability when we rise the altitude. And that's the main problem for the half of alpinists and high altitude tourists. But high altitude, it's not only the lack of oxygen. We've got also very low temperatures. Here you can see the video from the winter expedition to Broad Peak. As you can see here, the temperature decreases with every step you take, 6.5 degree of centigrade every 1,000 meters. So it's a quite huge decrease. Another environmental factor that has an impact on human body is solar radiation and the problems with sunburns and snow blindness, and of course low temperature may lead to hypothermia and to frostbite. Another problem at high altitude is the lack of water. Actually, there's a lot of water, but in the form of snow or ice. And to have it, you have to have a lot of energy, a lot of gas bottles or a fuel to melt the snow, and it takes a lot of time. So the alpinists usually are very prone to dehydration. And then the lack of energy. You eat what you will have in your backpack. So there's huge logistics to choose what kind of food to take, and usually the dried food is the one chosen for the higher camps at high altitude. And one of the most important problems at high altitude, apart from the oxygen, which is the main one, is the lack of emergency service. So higher you are, the higher the mountain, the less civilized country you are in. And usually in countries like Nepal, China, Pakistan, at the Himalayas and Karakoram, you cannot count for the emergency service. Or if the helicopter will come, it will come within, let's say, minimally 1-2 days. So actually you have to be self-sufficient when it comes to the therapy of acute problems at high altitude. And it's worth to be aware of that fact. But during this seminar, we will concentrate on the lack of oxygen as a main problem. But remember, mountains mean survival. We've got a lack of oxygen there, lack of shelter, lack of warmth, so the risk of hypothermia and frostbite, lack of water and energy, so the risk of deterioration due to dehydration and lack of energy and lack of emergency services. So we can share the altitudes into 4 categories. So the high altitude is over 1,500 meters till 3.5. Very high altitude is between 3.5 and 5.5. And remember, that's the borderline between, let's say, high altitude and extreme, and the death zone is 5,500 meters. So extreme altitude starts quite early, above 5,500 meters. And the death zone is over 7,500 meters. So our organism can stand being at such high altitudes, but our organism needs time to get used to the environmental conditions and to get used to the hypoxia which is around. And so this whole process of getting used to the new environmental factors is called acclimatization. And the most important acclimatization reactions when it's in the field of hypoxia is the rise of ventilatory response. So more you're acclimatized, more time you spend at high altitude, your organism will be able to ventilate with the higher frequency. Then the rise of hemoglobin level. So the more you stay at high altitude, the higher hemoglobin and hematocrit you will have. So the transport of oxygen will be more efficient. And then also due to higher ventilation, there will be the higher affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen, especially at the death zone and extreme altitudes. There are, of course, a lot of unknown changes at the cellular and systemic level. Body system acclimatized during different period of time, a few days or a couple of weeks. So, so many things, many physiological and pathophysiological problems at high altitude are not yet known. So what are the benefits of acclimatization? Why it's important to know the rules of acclimatization and benefit from it? Because if you're acclimatized, there's decreased risk of altitude sickness. So that's the main thing. Then you've got improved tolerance of altitude. So you can move faster, you can get to your optimal exertion tolerance. So better acclimatization, quicker movement at high altitude. And then you've got increased chances to realize your let's say, your plan, your dream of reaching the summit or finishing some difficult trekking. And you feel better at high altitude. So when you go for the vacations, for the holidays, for high altitude trekking, it's better to be acclimatized, because then your holidays will turn into disaster because of the symptoms of acute altitude illnesses. So let's imagine that you would like to go to Everest Base Camp. You would like to go for trekking in the Himalaya. Here on the picture you've got the south face of Lhotse, one of the 8,000 meter peaks that you can see during the trekking to Everest Base Camp. It looks very nice, and it has never been climbed without oxygen yet. So that's the information for the future alpinists. So the rules of acclimatization, the first and most important rules for 3, 4, 5, 6,000 meter peaks. So there are 3 things to remember. Spend your first night at a maximum altitude of 2,500 meters. So when you go for altitude, you shouldn't spend your first night at higher altitude than 2,500 meters. That's the first rule. The second rule, over 2,500 meters, the difference between the altitude of the places where you spend the night should be more than 300 to 500 meters. So when you spend the night at 2,500 meters, the next night you shouldn't spend at higher altitude than 3,000 meters. And the sleep altitude is important. No matter how high you will get during the day, the sleep altitude of the following night shouldn't be more than 500 meters. And then the third rule, every 1,000 meters of gain altitude, you should take 1 day of rest. So when you gain 1,000 meter during 2-3 days of your trekking, 2-3-4 days of your trekking, then you take a rest day. So you spend the second night at the same altitude. So remember those three numbers: 2,500 meters, the altitude of the first night; 500 meters, the altitude difference between the sleeping altitude; and 1,000 meter. Every 1,000 meter of gain altitude, take a rest day. So if you would like to draw an acclimatization schedule, should look like that. First night at 2,500 meters, second night, second day at 3,000 meters, and then the third day you reach 3,500 meters. So we've got 1,000 meters of altitude gain. So the fourth day and night we spend at 3.5. Then the fifth day you get to the 4,000 meters, sixth day to 4,500 meters, and then you've got another 1,000 meter of gain altitude, so you spend another night at 4,400 meters. So if you would like to get to Everest Base Camp from the south side in Nepal, which is at the altitude around 5,300 meters, you need at least 8 days at altitude to reach that altitude, reach the base camp. So if you would like to choose the company with which you would like to go, or you would plan it yourself, you should plan at least 8 days to reach the base camp. You should have some reserve days and the days to go back. So you need at least 2 weeks to get to the Everest Base Camp and to go back to civilization, to Kathmandu. So let's look on another rules of acclimatization. Part 2. So there's a rule: go high, sleep low. It means that during the day you can go higher. You can show your organism that it can be worse, but you should go back for the night at the lower altitude. The next thing is to take a rest day before the summit attack. If you choose to go, for example, for Mont Blanc, Kilimanjaro, Elbrus, Aconcagua, other peaks, maybe not so known, when you get to the last camp, you should take 1 day rest to hydrate yourself, to eat well, to rest before the summit push, which is the most important, most dangerous, and most difficult day of the whole expedition. And the summit push shouldn't be more than 1,000 meters of the altitude difference. So do not plan the last camp, let's say, more than 1,000 meters below the summit. Okay, so those are the rules, part 2. And if you would put them on the schedule that we already analyzed, I've just put some acclimatization, let's say, hikes during the day, after which you go back to sleep at the low altitude. So we can see here, you get to 3,000 meters, let's say you leave your stuff, you leave the backpack, you put a tent, and then if you've got some time, you can go a little bit higher and then go back to your tent for a sleep. Or when you get to, let's say, some high altitude shelter, high altitude, let's say, motel, you leave a hut, you leave your stuff, and you go up. Or during the rest day, it's also good to take some trip up and go back. So here we've got the real places where you can sleep on the trekking to Everest, Mount Everest Base Camp at Nepalese side, which is at 5,350 meters. So usually you take a plane and you land in Lukla, which is at the altitude of 2,500 meters around. And then you go to Faring. So that's the first place you can sleep. And it is at 2,650 meters. It's not a big deal to, let's say, sleep 150 meters from the gold standard 2,500 meters, so that's okay. But the next place where you can sleep is Namche Bazaar, which is 700 meters higher than Faring. So it wouldn't be good to go there directly the next day, because then you're at risk of acute altitude illness. So what to do? In such situations, you should take a rest day before such a big altitude difference. And during this rest day, you should adapt your organism to the higher altitude, so make some higher trip and go back to fighting. So that's the option that you can do. That's the rule that you have to follow if the difference between the sleeping altitude is bigger than 500 meters. Then during the third day, you arrive to Namche Bazaar, and it's like 1,000 meters altitude gain. So you take a day rest there with the altitude trip to Kumjung. And then during the fifth day, you get to Tengboche, it's 400 meters higher, so it's okay. Then the sixth day, you go to Ferice, which is 350 meters higher, so that's perfect. And then we've got a problem, because from Ferice to Lobucha is one more time 700 meters. So the same rule, take a rest day, go higher, and then go to Lobucha. And here we've got also 1,000 meter gain from Namche Bazaar, around 1,000 meters. So it's a good time also to take the rest because of that. And then you get to Lobucha. After Lobucha, you've got Gorakshep, 5,150 meters, so 250 meters more. And then during the 10th day, you get to Everest Base Camp. So according to our, let's say, original schedule, we should have taken like 8 days to reach the base camp. Here we've got 9 days, so that's perfect. If your real plan have the same amount of days as a theoretical plan, stemming out from acclimatization rules, that's okay. That's okay. So actually, you should count the days and then count the gain altitude, and it should be more than 500 meters a day of altitude gain. Of course, you can also plan, if you're more experienced, to go for the higher peaks, so 7, 6, 8,000 meter peaks. And the acclimatization rules on those peaks are a little bit different. So when you get to the base camp, on the way to the base camp, which you set at the altitude of 3,500 to 5,500 meters, you use the rules that we have described earlier. Okay, so this 200, 500, 2,500 meters, 500 meters, 1,000 meter rule, and you get to the base camp. But over the base camp, the rules are a little bit different. So the most important rule is to not sleep in the higher camps after first entry to the camp. So the rule is that first you have to touch the camp, so reach the camp, leave some stuff, go back to the lower camp, and after the rest, then sleep in the place where which you have already touched. Okay, and before those rounds, so going out from the base camp to the higher camps, you should take a rest at the base camp for 2 or 3 days. Here you can see the Himalayas alpinists going for Mount Everest from on the north side from Camp 1. That's the altitude over 7,000 meters. Here we've got Camp 2 and the Everest somewhere there. So let's imagine that you would like to plan to go for 8,000 meter peak. So how the acclimatization plan looks like. So you get to the base camp using those rules, sleeping at 2,500 meters, and then every night 500 meters more, and every 1,000 meters you take that day rest. And then you stay in the base camp and you touch Camp 1, go back to base camp, and during the next round you sleep in Camp 1, and you touch Camp 2, and you go back for the rest to the base camp. Then in the, let's say, second round of acclimatization, you sleep in Camp 1, sleep in Camp 2, which you have already touched, and then you touch the Camp 3, and you again go back to the base camp for 2 or 3 days of rest. And then during the third round, so third acclimatization round, you sleep in Camp 1, Camp 2, and Camp 3, and you go a little bit higher to adjust your organism. You go back for the rest, and during the four round in the summit, that's the summit push. And look how long the summit push takes. It takes 1 day to go to Camp 1, second day to Camp 2, third day to Camp 3, fourth day to reach the summit and go back to Camp 3, and the fifth day to go back to the base camp. So it takes like 5 to 6 days to reach the 8,000 meter peak for the base camp. That's the summit push period. So here you can see the broad peak in winter. Somewhere there we've got a top which is hidden. Here we've got the base camp. Base camp is at the altitude of Mont Blanc, 4,800 meters. Around here we've got camp 1, camp 2 is somewhere here, camp 3 is here, and then you go for the top. So that's the altitude plan for the broad peak expedition. And as you can see here, those 3 rounds on acclimatization push will take around 40 days. So you should plan, let's say, 1.5 to 2 months to reach the 8,000 meter peak. Okay, so that was about the acclimatization.